Hello and welcome to our 9th episode of the China under Trump series. Today we will be discussing North Korea, and joining me to cover this topic is John Nilsson-Wright, Senior Lecturer at the University of Cambridge and also Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
Pleasure.
So first off, just for context, we're filming this at the end of September 2017, and in recent weeks there really has been an escalation in tensions between the US and North Korea. We saw North Korea threatening to hit the US territory of Guam. Trump threatened to totally destroy North Korea during his UN General Assembly, but essentially we've seen really a severe escalation in recent weeks. Obviously, this is not news. Tensions and the relationship between the US and North Korea has been fraught for years. But why are we seeing this escalation right now? And have we seen something similar in recent history?
I think the simple reason for why the tensions have increased so much is a function of two things. One, the personality of the key actors, Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. Kim is a young leader. He's only been in power for 6 years. But he has a very simple set of objectives, which is military modernization, to keep the country strong, to give him the insurance policy he needs to protect him against an attack from the United States. And he is succeeding dramatically, as we saw with that nuclear test on September 3rd, a series of missile launches, most dramatically, of course, those two recent missile launches over Japan. It's very much, I think, part of his character to want to demonstrate to his own people that he can deliver on his promise of military modernization. And he is something of a risk taker, more so than his father and his grandfather before him. And of course, with Donald Trump, we have a president in the White House who is impulsive, who has a limited attention span, and who has also made the issue of North Korea a key part of his foreign policy priorities. He's taken the advice of Barack Obama, who said this is going to be the top item in your in-tray when you become president, and he was right. And to be fair to Donald Trump, much as it pains me to say this, Trump is right in saying that this issue, the North Korean challenge, has been left on the back burner for too long. And I think it's that combination of personalities and the very real success in military modernization that has made this an immediate and pressing danger that the Americans and their regional allies do have to resolve.
And as a consequence, Donald Trump and the US have really underscored that they really want China's support in trying to contain and try to solve the North Korean problem. And we have seen China implement some sanctions that in the latest round of UN sanctions, China has announced they will block exports of petroleum products, imports of textiles in the latest announcements. But to what extent can the US really, truly rely on Chinese help in trying to contain what is a Chinese ally?
China is not the magic bullet that is going to resolve the North Korean crisis, much as Trump would like it to be. The problem, I think, there is that the Chinese is often said, they want the nuclear problem to go away, but they don't want North Korea and the leadership of Kim Jong-un to go away. They want a stable North Korean ally. They fear there is the possibility of a collapse of the regime, opening up a security vacuum that the United States and South Korea might fill. They fear the possible mass exodus of refugees across the border if the country were to implode. And they worry about the practical and symbolic impact of an authoritarian regime in North Korea collapsing. After all, Xi Jinping is not a Democrat. The lesson would be, I think, the impact on Chinese public opinion of seeing a regime of that character implode would be something that the Chinese would want to avoid. So China is obviously the country that provides substantial economic and food assistance to North Korea. And China has tried through the implementation of these UN sanctions to demonstrate it's a good citizen. It's on the side of the international community and wanting to be seen to be doing something. But the measures that have been put in place will not be effective in stopping North Korea's WMD program. They will impose some pain on the North Korean government and particularly on the North Korean people. The textile sanctions, for example, are going to hit those ordinary North Koreans, women who work in that industry, but it's not going to retard the WMD program.
So based on what you just said, Where can we see the U.S. and Chinese relations going in the future? Because the U.S. is really putting the North Korea question at the heart of its relations with China. You would argue that a lot of the protectionist rhetoric during Trump's campaign, for instance, never really materialized, also because North Korea is so important to the U.S. and it really wants China to come on board and try to solve this issue. So where do you see this question taking U.S. and Chinese relations going forward?
I think the really important question is this latest round of US-sponsored sanctions, not UN sanctions. The US sanctions that are designed, as announced by Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, to target any foreign entity that engages in trade with North Korea. In principle, those are really potentially very far-ranging and punitive sanctions that would be hugely antagonistic to China, would risk provoking a trade war. And the question that we don't know the answer to yet is whether the United States is really serious about trying to implement them. Are they going to actually go after third parties that are engaged in business with North Korea, including Chinese banks, Chinese intermediaries? If they do that, then we're in uncharted territory. I suspect that this is more an effort by the administration to send a signal to China, to give them a potential lever with which to put pressure on the Chinese. But I think, given the importance of the bilateral trade relationship between the US and China, it would be counterproductive and foolhardy, frankly, for the Americans to really push the envelope on this. It would run the risk of sparking a potentially mutually destructive trade war.
And the billion-dollar question, John, I mean, is this situation, is there an actual solution that you envisage at the moment to this kind of situation between the US, China, and North Korea? Is a conflict actually a real possibility at this point?
I can't think of an event or a time in recent history where we've been facing such a potentially perilous situation. That doesn't mean that conflict's going to happen. But I think the worry for many actors, particularly America's key allies in the region, South Korea and Japan, is that the risk threshold has dropped appreciably. It's easy to imagine an escalation scenario in which Pyongyang and Washington misperceive the intentions and potential actions of one another. And the history of conflict on the Korean Peninsula, going back to the Korean War in 1950, is riddled with miscalculations and misperceptions. Just think of Kim Il-sung's decision to attack South Korea in June of 1950, confident that he was going to win, not anticipating the response of the Truman administration and the UN. Similarly, the overconfidence of General Douglas MacArthur, who assumed he could push north across the DMZ and reunite the peninsula without running the risk of Chinese intervention. Those sorts of historical lessons should make us pause. And particularly now that, of course, North Korea has these technically sophisticated military assets that they can deploy. Imagine a scenario in which an overconfident Kim Jong-un decides that he wants to engage in low-level provocations, not a massive show of force, but perhaps the shelling of contested territory in South Korea, or the dispatch of special forces south of the DMZ, or a cyber attack. Now, that might not look like a full-blown assault on South Korea or on the United States, but it would raise an interesting question: how would the United States respond? If Donald Trump feels that his red lines are being challenged, or if his authority is being challenged, does he then embrace the military option, whether it's a proportionate response from the US or a much bigger military intervention? The president is ultimately the person who makes that final decision, and he is constitutionally empowered to do that if he wishes. Even though we know that the so-called grown-ups in the room, Defense Secretary Mattis and the National Security Advisor, may be more cautious in the use of military force, the question we don't really know the answer to is what's going through the head of Donald Trump.
So I guess the stakes have never really been higher. Thank you so much for your insight, John. Thank you.
Pleasure.